Nobody walked the plank. Not once. Not in any court record, any captain's log, any surviving deposition from the Golden Age of Piracy. The image you grew up with, the blindfold, the sword at your back, the long drop into the water, was invented by a Victorian novelist in 1837, more than a century after pirates were gone. So what did they actually do to you? The answer is worse than any plank, and that's what this video is about. The walking the plank myth was invented on a specific date by a specific man, and pirates had been dead for 100 years before anyone thought of it. The year is 1837. Howard Pyle hasn't been born yet. Robert Louis Stevenson is still decades away. The man responsible is a British author named Howard Barker. Actually, let me be precise. It's Frederick Marryat, a Royal Navy captain turned novelist, who published The Pirate and Jacob Faithful in the early 1830s and populated them with theatrical cruelties that had no grounding in historical record. The specific plank scene that lodged in the cultural imagination appears in his 1836 novel The Pirate, and it spread because it was vivid, it was clean, and it fit a public appetite for pantomime villainy. By the time Howard Pyle illustrated it for Harper's Magazine in 1887, that famous image of a blindfolded man balanced at the edge of a plank over dark water, it became the definitive picture. 2 generations of children grew up with it. Disney cemented it. And the historians who tried to correct the record were drowned out by the image itself. And here's what the actual court records show. The Vice-Admiralty courts that tried pirates across Nassau, Port Royal, and Boston produced thousands of pages of witness testimony between 1690 and 1726. Survivors described what pirates did to them in considerable detail. Not one of them mentions a plank. Not one. That absence is the point. What they described instead was a menu of genuine cruelties, each with its own logic, and its own purpose, and its own history. The plank is fiction. Everything else is documented. The most common punishment in those court records, far more common than any execution, was also the most calculated to destroy a man slowly, and it started with a shore you could see but never reach. When pirates marooned a man, they gave him a pistol loaded with 1 ball. Not out of mercy, but to make certain he understood exactly what his options were. Marooning was the punishment pirates reserved for their own. You didn't maroon a captured merchant sailor. You marooned a crewman who had broken the articles. The written code that governed life aboard a pirate vessel. Stolen from a shipmate, shown cowardice in a fight, deserted your post, these were the offenses that earned it. The process was documented in multiple pirate trial records from the Vice-Admiralty courts. A man was put ashore on a low, uninhabited island or sandbar, often one that would be partially submerged at high tide. He received a bottle of water, sometimes a small ration of food, and a pistol with 1 charge of powder and shot. The pistol was not a kindness, it was a message. You have 1 round. You can use it to signal a passing ship. You can use it to end your own suffering. Those were your choices. And the pirates leaving you there wanted you to know they had thought it through. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, marooned members of Charles Vane's crew on a quay off the Bahamas in 1718. According to testimony given at the Nassau trials, the men were recovered by a passing sloop after several days, half dead from exposure. The record notes they were found in great distress, which in 18th century court language means they were close to finished. Israel Hands, one of Blackbeard's lieutenants who turned King's evidence to save his own neck, described marooning as the punishment the crew feared more than hanging. At the gallows, he said, it was over quickly. On that sand, it was not. But marooning was a punishment that required a shore, and when pirates were at sea with no land in sight, they used something entirely different. Something the Royal Navy had been doing for decades before the pirates borrowed it. Keel hauling wasn't a pirate invention. It came straight from the Dutch Navy, was codified in their maritime law in 1560, and by the 1600s, respectable naval officers were doing it as a matter of official procedure. The Dutch called it keelhalen. A rope was run beneath the hull of a ship from one side to the other, passing under the keel. The condemned man was tied to the rope, thrown overboard from the bow, and dragged under the ship along the barnacle-encrusted keel and up the other side. The barnacles on a working ship's hull after months at sea were not smooth. They were razor-edged, calcified, dense. The keel itself on a ship of any size was several feet below the waterline. The Dutch Admiralty formally included keel hauling in their disciplinary code, the Artikel Brief, from the mid-16th century. Paintings from the Dutch Golden Age show it being performed. Jan van Spijk's fleet log from the 1620s references its use. This was not extrajudicial sadism, it was regulation. By the late 1600s, the practice has spread across European navies. Whether pirates actually keel-hauled captives is harder to prove directly from records, but several depositions from the 1720s refer to pirates threatening it by name. The threat alone had value because sailors knew exactly what it meant. They'd seen it or heard accounts from men who'd survived it, which was not guaranteed. On a heavily fouled hull, a man could be open to the bone before he cleared the stern. The water pressure at depth, even a few feet, made it almost impossible to hold your breath through the full passage. The few who came up alive generally came up changed. The scars were visible for the rest of their lives. Keel hauling at least required a working ship and an organized crew. But the punishment I'm going to describe next describes nothing more than a length of rope, a deck, and the sun directly overhead. Pirates called it sweating. They made a captive run laps around the mast while the crew jabbed him with forks and blades. And contemporary accounts describe it as something the crew found genuinely funny. Captain Charles Johnson, the pseudonym used by the author of A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, and still the single most detailed contemporary source we have, describes sweating in specific terms. The crew would form a circle around the mainmast. A captive, usually a merchant officer who'd been deemed obstinate or whose cargo had not been willingly surrendered, was forced to run around the mast at a trot. The circle of men was armed with marlin spikes, forks, the points of cutlasses, or any sharp instrument they had at hand. Every time the captive slowed, he was prodded forward. This could last an hour. Johnson notes in at least one account that musicians played during it. There was a performance quality to the thing. It was a humiliation as a spectacle. Demonstration of complete power over another man's body. Johnson's General History describes it happening to captives taken by Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age by any measure of ships taken. Roberts captured an estimated 400 vessels between 1719 and 1722. His crew operated under detailed written articles that governed shares, weapons handling, and compensation for injuries sustained in battle. They were organized men, and they still did this. The sweating of a captive served a practical function beyond cruelty. It extracted information about cargo, hidden valuables, and the ship's destination. A man running in circles for an hour with no prospect of relief tells you where the money is. Roberts' articles raise a question worth sitting with. If pirates were organized enough to write their own legal codes, why were their punishments so deliberately extreme? And who actually decided what happened to a prisoner? Bartholomew Roberts' crew had a written constitution. It set working hours, banned gambling debts, and specified exactly how much compensation a man received for losing a leg. Yet that same document said nothing about how prisoners were to be treated. The articles Roberts' crew signed before departing on any voyage were recovered and published in Johnson's General History. Article 2 prohibited fighting aboard ship. Any quarrel was to be settled on shore with a pistol and cutlass. Article 8 specified that any man who lost a right arm in service would receive 600 pieces of eight from the common fund. A left arm, 500. A leg, 400. These were binding contractual obligations. Article 10 banned women from the ship entirely. Article 11 prohibited desertion before a prize was taken. These were practical rules for maintaining a functional fighting crew over months at sea. But no article governed what happened to captives. That was left to the spontaneous authority of the crew as a collective and the captain's discretion in the moment. This is the gap where the worst behavior lived. The articles were a social contract among the pirates themselves. Everyone else existed outside them. Edward Lowe, one of the most documented sadists in the Golden Age, operated with articles broadly similar to Roberts' for his own crew's conduct. His treatment of captives was another matter entirely. Lowe was tried in absentia in Boston in 1723 after witnesses described him cutting off a Portuguese captain's lips with a penknife, cooking them, and forcing the man's crew to watch. The Boston Newsletter, the first regularly published newspaper in the American colonies, printed the account. It was not rumor, it was testimony under oath. Lowe's case is documented because he was eventually caught in the net of a coordinated naval campaign that had been building since 1717. And the man who ran that campaign understood the spectacle was the only thing that would end the Golden Age for good. In 1718, one man arrived in Nassau with the royal pardon in one hand and a warrant for execution in the other. And within 4 months, he ended the Republic of Pirates. Woodes Rogers was a privateer and merchant captain who had circumnavigated the globe between 1708 and 1711. He was not a naval officer, he was a businessman with sea experience and no patience for disorder. In 1718, the British Crown appointed him the first royal governor of the Bahamas with a specific commission: clear Nassau of pirates. He arrived on July 27, 1718, aboard HMS Delicia, accompanied by 3 Royal Navy warships and a troop of soldiers. Charles Vane, who refused the pardon, fired a cannon at Rogers' fleet and ran for open water. Most of the pirates in Nassau took the pardon because the alternative was immediate and visible. Rogers then set about demonstrating that the pardon was a single opportunity. When 8 men who had accepted it were subsequently caught pirating again, Rogers convened a Vice-Admiralty court and had them hanged on the fort's rampart December 12, 1718. He had the bodies left visible from the harbor. The point was deliberate. His administration was documented in his own correspondence, preserved in the Colonial Office papers at the Public Records Office in London. In a letter to the Board of Trade in 1719, Rogers described the Bahamas as infested before his arrival, and noted that the public hangings had done more to suppress the trade than 10 years of naval patrol. He understood that the pirate economy had survived because it had no credible counter-threat, and he provided one. Rogers cleared Nassau, but the open Atlantic was harder to police, and one trial, held in Cape Coast Castle in West Africa in 1722 would become the formal death certificate of the Golden Age. The largest pirate trial in history took place not in London or Nassau, but on the coast of West Africa in 1722, and it ended with 52 men hanged in the space of 2 weeks. Bartholomew Roberts was killed on February 10th, 1722, when HMS Swallow under Captain Challoner Ogle caught his ship, the Royal Fortune, off Cape Lopez on the West African coast. Roberts was hit by grape shot in the throat and died on deck. His crew, per the articles he had written himself, threw his body overboard before surrendering. They honored that article even at the moment of final defeat. Captain Ogle brought the survivors, 272 men, Cape Coast Castle, the British slave trading fort on the Gold Coast of what is now Ghana. The Vice-Admiralty court convened there under the presidency of General Phipps, the governor of the Royal African Company. The trial ran from March 28th to April 4th in 1722, and it was the largest judicial proceeding against pirates in the history of British maritime law. 52 men were sentenced to hang. 17 were given lesser sentences of penal servitude in the Royal African Company's operations, which amounted to forced labor in the worst conditions on the African coast. 74 men were acquitted on grounds that they had been forced pirates, pressed into service against their will. The records were thorough. Witnesses were cross-examined. The forced versus voluntary distinction mattered because it was a legal category, not a sentiment. The court had a procedure and it used it. The hangings were carried out in batches along the castle shoreline. The bodies were displayed at points along the coast, visible to passing ships, per standard Admiralty practice for piracy convictions. The Cape Coast trial was the judicial end, but there was a physical geography to the Golden Age that made it possible in the first place, and understanding where these men operated explains why it took so long to shut them down. The so-called Pirate Round, a trade route that looped from the American colonies down to Madagascar and across to the Red Sea, was the economic engine of the Golden Age. And without the merchants of New York and Boston, it would have never existed. Between roughly 1693 and 1701, a specific circuit of piracy operated with the quiet support of colonial merchants. A pirate crew would leave a port like Newport, Rhode Island, or New York, sail south to Madagascar, which functioned as an open provisioning base, and then north into the Red Sea and Indian Ocean to raid Mughal shipping. The target was Mughal trade vessels running between Surat and the Red Sea ports. These ships carried enormous sums in gold, silver, and trade goods. The 1695 attack on the Ganj-e-Sawai by Henry Every netted an estimated 600,000 pounds, the equivalent today of perhaps 90 million pounds. Every's crew then dispersed across the Caribbean and American colonies, and several were arrested in Boston and Philadelphia, with Mughal coins still in their pockets. The colonial merchants who supplied these crews, Frederick Phillips of New York being the most documented, made fortunes selling provisions and buying plundered goods at steep discounts. Phillips was one of the wealthiest men in the American colonies, and his Madagascar trade was an open secret. Governor Benjamin Fletcher of New York actively protected the arrangement and accepted bribes directly, according to testimony given to the Board of Trade in London, 1698. The Pirate Round collapsed when the East India Company applied pressure on the Crown to act. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb had threatened to expel British merchants from Surat after Every's raid. The diplomatic consequence of piracy, not the piracy itself, is what finally produced enforcement. The collapse of the Pirate Round pushed crews back into the Caribbean and Atlantic, just as a new generation of captains was forming, men who had served in the War of the Spanish Succession and found themselves suddenly unemployed in 1714. The walking the plank myth didn't just get history wrong. It erased the actual victims, who were real people, whose names, ship names, and cargo losses are recorded in documents still available in the National Archives. The Vice-Admiralty court papers from Nassau, Boston, and London between 1716 and 1726 contain the depositions of hundreds of merchant sailors who survived pirate attacks. They are not romantic documents. They describe men held below decks 4 days, subjected to questioning at knife point about hidden valuables, forced to watch the destruction of their ships and cargo. Several depositions describe crewmen being beaten until they confirmed that all goods had been declared. Others describe captives being held as forced crew for months at a time, unable to leave without risking execution for piracy themselves. The Boston Gazette and the American Weekly Mercury of Philadelphia both covered pirate trials extensively between 1717 and 1726. The Mercury ran full transcripts of Stede Bonnet's trial in Charleston in 1718. Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, a Barbadian landowner who bought a ship and turned pirate for reasons his contemporaries found baffling, was hanged at White Point in Charleston on December 10, 1718, along with 29 of his crew. The gallows faced the harbor. These men existed. The ships they took are listed in Lloyd's casualty records from the period. The cargo losses are enumerated in insurance claims filed in London. The romantic image of piracy, the plank, the skull and crossbones flag as a kind of brand, the code of honor, was built on top of documented suffering that the myth made invisible. The plank never happened. What happened instead is in the record. You just have to read it. Which raises the final question. If the real history is this rich, this specific, this dark, why did we settle for a Victorian fairy tale? The through line this video is set out to answer, what did pirates actually do if not walk the plank? They marooned men on sandbars with a single pistol round and let the sun and the water decide the outcome. They dragged prisoners beneath their hull past barnacles that could strip a man to bone. They ran captives in circles around the mast while the crew kept score. They had articles, written, signed, legally enforceable among themselves, and no articles at all for anyone else. The worst of them did things that ended up in colonial newspapers, in Admiralty correspondence, in insurance ledgers, and in the sworn depositions of survivors who wanted the records straight. The plank was a clean image. It was tidy, theatrical, and it had a satisfying drop at the end. The real history had none of that tidiness. It has names, dates, ship manifests, court records. It had Bartholomew Roberts throwing his own captain's body overboard because the article said to. It has Woodes Rogers stacking bodies on a Nassau rampart so every ship coming into harbor could see them. The myth was comfortable. The record is not. And the record is always more interesting. If this is the kind of history you want more of, specific, sourced, and not cleaned up for polite company, I've written a novel set inside this world. The first chapter is free. The link is in the description. chrissterling.com/chapter-1. Read it, and if it's for you, you'll know within the first page. If you want to stay here, subscribe, and I'll keep going.